Hello, book lover. Welcome to the third session of the guided reading of Anne Brontë's Agnes Grey, a classic of Victorian literature. It's great to have you here with me today. But before we get started and we talk about what we discussed last time and what we're going to read today, I have a very special invitation for you, book lover who loves to read the classics of literature. Perhaps you feel intimidated by some of the titles on your bookshelves, or perhaps you want to read more classics of literature that seem daunting to you, or even sometimes you feel lost when you're reading a classic of literature and you would like some guidance. Then I have a very special invitation for you indeed. So, there's something very magical coming up on the 23rd of September. So that's on Monday. And it's the first day of the Classic Reader Week at Books and Culture. It's a series of free online literature classes. So if you want to be part of this literary journey, register right now to save your spot. You will find the link to register in the description box of this video. You will also find it on my Instagram bio. So I hope you sign up for the class and that you really enjoy those classes and that they help you become a confident reader of the classics of literature, because that is a fascinating world that you want to be a part of. Right. So today, session 3, we're going to read chapters 4 and 5 of Agnes Grey. But before we do that, as usual, let's take a step back and think about what we read and discussed last time. Last time we read chapters 2 and 3. So our protagonist, Agnes Grey, has left her home, has left her family, who's struggling with debt, as you know, to find her own path and also to find a way to help her family financially. So she decides to become a governess. At first, this idea is not very well received by her family. Um, well, being a governess is in the Victorian era, the governess is an in between social role, right? So a governess is in a higher social position than the other servants in a house, for instance, but they are in a lower position than the members of the family, the owners of the house. So it is a middle class, normally middle class girls would find this job because they needed to have the background knowledge, the education growing up. So girls from the lower class would not have had that opportunity, that privilege of education. So middle class women, middle class girls would have had that education and would be able to work as governesses, which is the case of Agnes. And she also wants to prove herself to her family that she's able to uh, go on her own, to take care of children. That's her job as a governess, right? Um, and so she goes to um, Wellwood Mansion, the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield and their children. And we read last time the first impressions of Agnes of the place, of the children. And we have to say that that's not a very welcoming, cheerful place. Agnes is used to having a home or living in a home full of love. Their parents married out of love, which was not very common at the time. I mean, it was common, but depending on the social classes, right? So her mother was of um, a family higher up in the social scale, but she gave up her position, her social position, her inheritance to marry the love of her life, Mr. Grey. Um, and that affected her standing in life and her quality of life. But she did it out of love. So their household was filled with love for one another. And that is not the case with the Bloomfields. You can see that their match, Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield, was most likely not a love match. And that is reflected on the characters of the children. The children did not receive much love either. And what we get in chapter 3, we get more information about the members of that family. Mr. Bloomfield is always complaining. He's a terrible man. Mrs. Bloomfield um, is not very cheerful or welcoming, but we learn that she's not that submissive to Mr. Bloomfield, to her husband, which is quite interesting. He was complaining about dinner, and she said something like, "Why don't you make dinner yourself?" So that's quite bold for the time. And the children, Tom, Marianne, and the little one, Fanny. Tom is the oldest, Master Tom, and he is terrible. He's terrible. He wants to be the ruler and rule over, even over the governess. He has control over her, and that should be the other way around. So Agnes is very uncomfortable with this situation. Um, Marianne is also uncontrollable, a little less than Tom. They're both terrible. And in addition to teaching, Agnes has to sleep with Marianne, to wash her, dress her, get her to bed. So she has little to no time for herself. So it's very, very intense work. She works all the time, every day. Um, and she has been trying to teach some morals to the children. Tom is very aggressive and uh, disobedient. She's trying to teach him and Marianne how to be well-behaved children. And Fanny, the little one, she thinks, so maybe with her, with a clean slate, I can get her to be a nice child. But after a few months there's been no improvement. And what is worse, the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield, start to blame Agnes for the lack of improvement in the children. And that's where we left off last time. So now we're going to get started with chapter 4, called The Grandmama. Let's see what happens to Agnes, poor Agnes, in as she struggles as a governess at the Bloomfields' Wellwood Mansion. I spare my readers the account of my delight on coming home, my happiness while there, enjoying a brief space of rest and liberty in that dear familiar place among the loving and the loved, and my sorrow on being obliged to bid them once more a long adieu. So she went home for Christmas, right? For the holidays. And she compares her loving home, those being among those loving and loved, um, and but it hurt again to say goodbye and to return to her work. I returned, however, with unabated vigor to my work, a more arduous task than any one can imagine who has not felt something like the misery of being charged with the care and direction of a set of mischievous, turbulent rebels whom his utmost exertions cannot bind to their duty, while at the same time he is responsible for their conduct to a higher power who exacts from him what cannot be achieved without the aid of the superior's more potent authority, which either from indolence or the fear of becoming unpopular with the said rebellious gang, the latter refuses to give. I can conceive few situations more harassing than that wherein, however you may long for success, however you may labor to fulfill your duty, your efforts are baffled and set at naught by those beneath you, and unjustly censured and misjudged by those above. I have not enumerated half the vexatious propensities of my pupils, or half the troubles resulting from my heavy responsibilities, for fear of trespassing too much upon the reader's patience, as perhaps I have already done. But my design in writing the few last pages was not to amuse, but to benefit those whom it might concern. He that has no interest in such matters will doubtless have skipped them over with a cursory glance, and perhaps a malediction against the prolixity of the writer. But if a parent has therefrom gathered any useful hint, or an unfortunate governess received thereby the slightest benefit, I am well rewarded for my pains. Now, here is interesting because the narrator, Agnes Grey, directs herself to the reader, right? and so kind of breaks the fourth wall and talks directly to the reader, which is quite interesting, right? And innovative at the time. So she's saying, "Oh, perhaps I wrote too much and I wrote for too long in the past few chapters, writing about my day to day and my difficulties. But I didn't do that to amuse the reader, but I did that as a means to be useful to someone else, perhaps someone in a similar situation, parents or a governess, how she handled the situation, right? Or how she's trying to handle the situation." To avoid trouble and confusion, I have taken my pupils one by one and discussed their various qualities. But this can give no adequate idea of being worried by the whole three together, when, as was often the case, all were determined to be naughty and to tease Miss Grey and put her in a passion. Sometimes on such occasions, the thought that has suddenly occurred to me, if they could see me now, meaning, of course, my friends at home, and the idea of how they would pity me has made me pity myself so greatly that I have had the utmost difficulty to restrain my tears. But I have restrained them till my little tormentors were gone to dessert or cleared off to bed, my only prospects of deliverance, and then in all the bliss of solitude, I have given myself up to the luxury of an unrestricted burst of weeping. But this was a weakness I did not often indulge. My employments were too numerous, my leisure moments were too precious to admit of much time being given to fruitless lamentations. So poor little Agnes, right? She holds all her tears. She goes through the day, and when she's alone in the solitude of her, uh, not her bedroom because she shares it with Marianne, but is the solitude of her bed, then she cries alone. I particularly remember one wild, snowy afternoon. One wild, snowy afternoon. Remember, we talked about emotional landscape, right? I'm sure nothing positive will come out of this day because of the way it's been described. Wild, snowy afternoon. Soon after my return in January, the children had all come up from dinner, loudly declaring that they meant to be naughty, and they had well kept their resolution, though I had talked myself hoarse and wearied every muscle in my throat in the vain attempt to reason them out of it. I had got Tom pinned up in a corner, whence I told him he should not escape till he had done his appointed task. Meantime, Fanny had possessed herself of my work-bag and was rifling its contents and spitting into it besides. I told her to let it alone, but no purpose, of course. She's being tormented by these kids, right? So they took her working bag. That means where she would put um, the tools that she needed for work, such as embroidering, sewing, you know. And look at what Tom says. So Fanny's spitting inside her bag, and Tom cries, "Burn it, Fanny!" cried Tom, and this command she hastened to obey. I sprang to snatch it from the fire, and Tom darted to the door. "Marianne, throw her desk out of the window!" cried he, and my precious desk, containing my letters and papers, my small amount of cash, and all my valuables, was about to be precipitated from the three-story window. Let me adjust the camera. Yes. So can you imagine? He told Marianne to throw her desk, her writing desk, portable writing desk, out of the window. And she was about to do it, and I flew to rescue it. Meanwhile, Tom had left the room and was rushing down the stairs, followed by Fanny. Having secured my desk, I ran to catch them, and Marianne came scampering after. All three escaped me and ran out of the house into the garden, where they plunged about in the snow, shouting and screaming in exultant glee. What must I do? If I followed them, I should probably be unable to capture one, and only drive them farther away. If I did not, how was I to get them in? And what would their parents think of me if they saw or heard the children rioting, hatless, bonnetless, gloveless, and bootless in the deep, soft snow? While I stood in this perplexity, just without the door, trying by grim looks and angry words to awe them into subjection, I heard a voice behind me, in harshly piercing tones, exclaiming, Miss Grey, is it possible? What in the devil's name can you be thinking about? I can't get him in, sir, said I, turning round and beholding Mr. Bloomfield, with his hair on end and his pale blue eyes bolting from their sockets. But I insist upon their being got in, cried he, approaching nearer and looking perfectly ferocious. Then, sir, you must call them yourself, if you please, for they won't listen to me, I replied, stepping back. Come in with you, you filthy brats, or I'll horsewhip you every one, roared he, and the children instantly obeyed. There, you see, they come at the first word. Yes, when you speak. And it's very strange that when you've the care of them, you've no better control over them than that. Now, there they are, gone upstairs with their nasty, snowy feet. Do go after them and see them made decent, for heaven's sake. That gentleman's mother was then staying in the house, the grandmamma, the title of this chapter. And as I ascended the stairs and passed the drawing-room door, I had the satisfaction of hearing the old lady declaiming aloud to her daughter-in-law to this effect, for I could only distinguish the most emphatic words. Gracious heavens! Never in all my life get their death as sure as... Do you think, my dear, she's a proper person? Take my word for it. This is because she only heard parts of the conversation, the words that she stressed more, right? So, do you think, my dear, she's a proper person? So, of course, she's referring to Agnes. I heard no more, but that sufficed. The senior Mrs. Bloomfield had been very attentive and civil to me, and till now I had thought her a nice, kind-hearted, chatty old body. That is the grandmamma. She would often come to me and talk in a confidential strain, nodding and shaking her head, and gesticulating with hands and eyes, as a certain class of old ladies are wont to do, though I never knew one that carried the peculiarity to so great an extent. She would even sympathize with me for the trouble I had with the children, and express at times by half sentences, interspersed with nods and knowing winks, her sense of the injudicious conduct of their mamma in so restricting my power and neglecting to support me with her authority. Such a mode of testifying disapprobation was not much to my taste, and I generally refused to take it in or understand anything more than was openly spoken. At least I never went farther than an implied acknowledgment that, if matters were otherwise ordered, my task would be a less difficult one, and I should be better able to guide and instruct my charge. But now I must be doubly cautious. Hitherto, though I saw the old lady had her defects, of which one was a proneness to proclaim her perfections, I had always been wishful to excuse them and to give her credit for all the virtues she professed, and even imagine others yet untold. Kindness, which had been the food of my life through so many years, had lately been so entirely denied me that I welcomed with grateful joy the slightest semblance of it. Poor child, right? So she was being so she felt so neglected, and she did not feel the love that she felt at home. That when she saw a kind person in Grandma Bloomfield, she immediately connected with her from this need of being accepted, of being not loved but being acknowledged, right? But then she hears this conversation and realizes that the grandma is not who she seems to be. No wonder then that my heart warmed to the old lady and always gladdened at her approach and regretted her departure. But now the few words, luckily or unluckily heard in passing, had wholly revolutionized my ideas respecting her. Now I looked upon her as hypocritical and insincere, a flatterer and a spy upon my words and deeds. Doubtless it would have been my interest still to meet her with the same cheerful smile and tone of respectful cordiality as before. But I could not. If I would, my manner altered with my feelings and became so cold and shy that she could not fail to notice it. She soon did notice it, and her manner altered too. The familiar nod was changed to a stiff bow. The gracious smile gave place to a glare of Gorgon ferocity. Her vivacious loquacity was entirely transferred from me to the darling boys and girls, whom she flattered and indulged more absurdly than ever their mothers had done. So all of a sudden, the grandma changes as she realizes that Agnes has changed towards her. She becomes cold and she overindulges the children, making it all the worse for Agnes, right? I confess I was somewhat troubled at this change. I feared the consequences of her displeasure and even made some efforts to recover the grounds I had lost, and with better apparent success than I could have anticipated. At one time, I, merely in common civility, asked after her cough. Immediately her long visage relaxed into a smile, and she favored me with a particular history of that and her other infirmities, followed by an account of her pious resignation delivered in the usual emphatic, declamatory style which no writing can portray. But there's one remedy for all, my dear, and that's resignation. A toss of the head. You can only imagine, right, the whole performance in your head. Resignation to the will of heaven, an uplifting of hands and eyes. It has always supported me through all my trials and always will do. Succession of nods. But then it isn't everybody that can say that. Shake of the head. But I'm one of the pious ones, Miss Grey. A very significant nod and toss. And thank heaven I always was. Another nod. And I glory in it. An emphatic clasping of the hands and shaking of the head. And with several texts of scripture misquoted or misapplied, and religious exclamations so redolent of the ludicrous in the style of delivery and manner of bringing in, if not in the expressions themselves, that I decline repeating them. She withdrew, tossing her large head in high good humor, with herself at least, and left me hoping that after all she was rather weak than wicked. At her next visit to Wellwood House, I went so far as to say I was glad to see her looking so well. The effect of this was magical. The words, intended as a mark of civility, were received as a flattering compliment. Her countenance brightened up, and from that moment she became as gracious and benign as heart could wish. In outward semblance at least, and from what I now saw of her and what I heard from the children, I knew that in order to gain her cordial friendship, I had but to utter a word of flattery at each convenient opportunity. But this was against my principles, and for lack of this, the capricious old dame soon deprived me of her favor again, and I believe did me much secret injury. So Agnes refuses to flatter the old lady in order to get her favor, and that did her a lot of harm, although in secret. So she thinks that most likely the Grandma Bloomfield said things or, you know, influenced Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield in certain ways, negative ways regarding Agnes's job. She could not greatly influence her daughter-in-law against me, because between that lady and herself there was a mutual dislike, chiefly shown by her in secret detractions and calumniations, by the other in an excess of frigid formality in her demeanor. And no fawning flattery of the elder could thaw away the wall of ice which the younger interposed between them. But with her son the old lady had better success. He would listen to all she had to say, provided she could soothe his fretful temper and refrain from irritating him by her own asperities. And I have reason to believe that she considerably strengthened his prejudice against me. She would tell him that I shamefully neglected the children, and even his wife did not attend to them as she ought, and that he must look after them himself, or they would all go to ruin. Thus urged, he would frequently give himself the trouble of watching them from the windows during their play. At times he would follow them through the grounds, and too often came suddenly upon them while they were dabbling in the forbidden well, talking to the coachman in the stables, or reveling the filth of the farmyard. And I, meanwhile, stupidly standing by, having previously exhausted my energy in vain attempts to get them away. Often, too, he would unexpectedly pop his head into the schoolroom while the young people were at meals, and find them spilling their milk over the table and themselves, plunging their fingers into their own or each other's mugs, or quarreling over their victuals like a set of tigers' cubs. If I were quiet at the moment, I was conniving at their disorderly conduct. If, as was frequently the case, I happened to be exalting my voice to enforce order, I was using undue violence and setting the girls a bad example by such ungentleness of tone and language. You see, she could not win, right? So she was being more constantly surveyed. And Mr. Bloomfield would come to her at the very moments in which the kids were behaving the worst. So outside, if they're, playing with mud or going to the stable, getting themselves all dirty and disheveled, that's when he would show up. Or if he popped his head into the schoolroom, he would find them fighting over their food. And no matter what Agnes was doing, if she was quiet or if she was uh, yelling or exalted in a way, that will be considered, in any case, it would be considered inappropriate. So it was tough for her, right? She was not feeling appreciated in her efforts at all. I remember one afternoon in spring when, owing to the rain, they could not go out. But by some amazing good fortune, they had all finished their lessons and yet abstained from running down to tease their parents. A trick that annoyed me greatly, but which, on rainy days, I seldom could prevent their doing, because below they found novelty and amusement, especially when visitors were in the house, and their mother, though she bid me keep them in the schoolroom, would never chide them for leaving it, or trouble herself to send them back. But today they appeared satisfied with their present abode, and what is more wonderful still, seemed disposed to play together without depending on me for amusement, and without quarreling with each other. Their occupation was a somewhat puzzling one. They were all squatted together on the floor by the window, over a heap of broken toys and a quantity of birds' eggs, or rather eggshells, for the contents had luckily been abstracted. These shells they had broken up and were pounding into small fragments. To what end I could not imagine, but so long as they were quiet and not in positive mischief, I did not care. And with a feeling of unusual repose, I sat by the fire, putting the finishing stitches to a frock for Marianne's doll. So, on top of everything, she would sew clothes for Marianne's dolls, intending, when that was done, to begin a letter to my mother. But suddenly the door opened, and the dingy head of Mr. Bloomfield looked in. "All very quiet here. What are you doing?" said he. "No harm today, at least," thought I. But he was of a different opinion. Advancing to the window and seeing the children's occupation, he testily exclaimed, "What in the world are you about?" "We're grinding eggshells, papa," cried Tom. "How dare you make such a mess, you little devils? Don't you see what confounded work you're making of the carpet?" The carpet was a plain brown drugget. That's a comment by Agnes. "Miss Grey, did you know what they were doing?" "Yes, sir." "You knew it?" "Yes." "You knew it, and you actually sat there and permitted them to go on without a word of reproof." "I didn't think they were doing any harm." "Any harm? Well, why, look here. Just look at that carpet and see. Was there ever anything like it in a Christian house before? No wonder your room is not fit for a pigsty. No wonder your pupils are worse than a litter of pigs. No wonder. Oh, I declare it puts me quite past my patience." And he departed, shutting the door after him with a bang that made the children laugh. "It puts me quite past my patience, too," muttered I, getting up, and seizing the poker, I dashed it repeatedly into the cinders and stirred them up with unwonted energy, thus easing my irritation under pretence of mending the fire. After this, Mr. Bloomfield was continually looking in to see if the schoolroom was in order. And as the children were continually littering the floor with fragments of toys, sticks, stones, stubble, leaves, and other rubbish which I could not prevent their bringing, or oblige them to gather up, and which the servants refused to clear after them, I had to spend a considerable portion of my valuable leisure moments on my knees upon the floor in painfully reducing things to order. Something else that she has to do now, on top of everything. So she has less and less time for herself. She didn't even have the time to write a letter to her mom. Once I told them that they should not taste their supper till they had picked up everything from the carpet. Fanny might have hers when she had taken up a certain quantity, Marianne when she had gathered twice as many, and Tom was to clear away the rest. Wonderful to state, the girls did their part, but Tom was in such a fury that he flew upon the table, scattered the bread and milk about the floor, struck his sisters, kicked the coals out of the coal pan, attempted to overthrow the table and chairs, and seemed inclined to make a Douglas larder of the whole contents of the room. But I seized upon him, and sending Marianne to call her mamma, held him in spite of his kicks, blows, yells, and execrations, till Mrs. Bloomfield made her appearance. Now, here's an interesting footnote for us to understand the context, right? So here she writes that Tom seemed inclined to make a Douglas larder of the whole contents of the room. What does Douglas larder mean? Now, that's a reference that contemporary readers, so readers at the time this came out, would be familiar with and would make the connection. But us, centuries later, well, this reference is lost, right? Most likely for most readers. Let's take a look at this. Footnote 7. Douglas larder. This expression recalls an incident in 1307 concerning Sir James Douglas, a Scotsman. On discovering that his lands had been taken during his absence by the Englishman Robert the Clifford, Douglas attacked his own castle. The incident would have been familiar to Brontë from the works of Sir Walter Scott, who was a favorite of the Brontë sisters. In Tales of a Grandfather, Scott describes the incident as follows. Douglas caused all the barrels containing flour, meat, wheat, and malt to be knocked in pieces, and their contents mixed on the floor. Then he staved the great hogsheads of wine and ale, and mixed the liquor with the stores. And last of all, he killed the prisoners, and flung the dead bodies among this disgusting heap, which his men called, in derision of the English, the Douglas larder. So, a room full of, all disorganized and full of dead bodies. In this case, it's because Tom was making such a mess and killing everything in his wake, right? Inclined to make a Douglas ladder of the whole contents of the room, destroy everything, right? And then Mrs. Bloomfield comes. "What is the matter with my boy?" said she. And when the matter was explained to her, all she did was to send for the nursery maid to put the room in order and bring Master Bloomfield his supper. So the mother does not help at all, right? She undermines the authority of Agnes as a governess. And on top of everything, she does not, for example, in this case, that he was clearly misbehaving, she does not reprove his behavior. Quite the contrary, just tell him to tell someone to bring him his dinner. So it normalizes the situation, which makes, of course, matters worse. "There now," cried Tom triumphantly, looking up from his viands with his mouth almost too full for speech. There now, Miss Grey, you see I have got my supper in spite of you, and I haven't picked up a single thing. Look at the danger of these words, right? This is a boy. Imagine when he grows older. The only person in the house who had any real sympathy for me was the nurse, for she had suffered like afflictions, though in a smaller degree, as she had not the task of teaching, nor was she so responsible for the conduct of her charge. So the nurses would take care of the children up to the age of 4, 5, 6, depending. And so they would also face many challenges. And they would come from lower social class because they would be fit to take care of babies and very young children, but not, they would not have the education to teach older children. Um, oh, Miss Grey, she would say, you have some trouble with them children. I have indeed, Betty, and I dare say you know what it is. I do so, but I don't vex myself over them as you do. And then, you see, I hit them a slap sometimes, and the little ones, I gives them a good whipping now and then. There's nothing else will do for them, as what they say. However, I've lost my place for it. Have you, Betty? I heard you were going to leave. Bless you, yes, Mrs. gave me warning 3 weeks since. She told me afore Christmas how it must be if I hit them again, but I couldn't hold my hand off them at nothing. I know not how you do, for Miss Marianne's worse by the half, nor her sisters. And well, you will see the written version. It's a transcription of the way of speaking. So it's not a dialect. It's not a dialect, but it's an accent from the lower classes, right? Of course, I cannot reproduce that, so I just read it normally. Let's say quotation marks, so in standard English. So the nurse has been fired for hitting the children, for slapping the children. But the children were so uncontrollable that the nurse, there was nothing else the nurse could do um, to get hold, to control the young children. And that's the end of chapter 4. So here we learn, we get to know a new character, 2 new characters, the maid at the end of this chapter and the grandma, and how the grandma is a bad influence on the children. So she's a flatterer, but if she wants to be flattered. If she does not get her way, she then does anything in her power. For example, Agnes does not flatter her, so she does not gain her favor. And as a consequence, the grandma does whatever she can to make life harder for Agnes. And that includes overindulging the children where they should be controlled. So giving them um, compliments and liberty when they should, in fact, be given reproofs and being controlled, right? So things are not working out for Agnes just yet. Things are, in fact, going worse. She's losing control. And she does not get the help of Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield, who, on the quite the contrary, undermine her authority. So now we're going to read chapter 5, which is called The Uncle. So another member of the family. Let's see how that one affects Agnes's role in this family. Chapter 5. Besides the old lady, there was another relative of the family whose visits were a great annoyance to me. This was Uncle Robson, Mrs. Bloomfield's brother, a tall, self-sufficient fellow with dark hair and sallow complexion like his sister, a nose that seemed to disdain the earth, and little gray eyes, frequently half closed, with a mixture of real stupidity and affected contempt of all surrounding objects. I love this description. A nose that seemed to disdain the earth, everything, in other words, and a face with a mixture of real stupidity and affected contempt of all surrounding objects. So everything would be inferior to him and would annoy him. He was a thick-set, strongly built man, but he had found some means of compressing his waist into a remarkably small compass, and that, together with the unnatural stiffness of his form, showed that the lofty-minded, manly Mr. Robson, the scorner of the female sex, was not above the foppery of stays. And foppery means affected and excessive concern with one's clothes and appearance. So although he disdained the female sex, he was quite concerned about what he wore, a feminine trait, let's say. He seldom deigned to notice me, and when he did, it was with a certain supercilious insolence of tone and manner that convinced me he was no gentleman, though it was intended to have a contrary effect. But it was not for that I disliked his coming so much as for the harm he did the children, encouraging all their evil propensities and undoing in a few minutes the little good it had taken me months of labor to achieve. So another bad influence for the children, encouraging their bad behavior. Fanny and little Harriet he seldom condescended to notice, but Marianne was something of a favorite. He was continually encouraging her tendency to affectation, which I had done my utmost to crush, talking about her pretty face and filling her head with all manner of conceited notions concerning her personal appearance, which I had instructed her to regard as dust in the balance compared with the cultivation of her mind and manners. So she was trying to teach Marianne the importance of being educated, of education and knowledge and morality, in opposition to physical beauty. But her uncle comes and ruins it, making her vain. And I never saw a child so susceptible of flattery as she was. Whatever was wrong in either her or her brother, he would encourage by laughing at, if not by actually praising. And people little know the injury they do to children by laughing at their faults, and making a pleasant jest of what their true friends have endeavored to teach them to hold in grave abhorrence. Though not a positive drunkard, Mr. Robson habitually swallowed great quantities of wine, and took with relish an occasional glass of brandy and water. He taught his nephew to imitate him in this. Tom, 10-year-old, he taught Tom how to drink to the utmost of his ability, and to believe that the more wine and spirits he could take, and the better he liked them, the more he manifested his bold and manly spirit, and rose superior to his sister. Look at the danger here of this influence on Tom. Mr. Bloomfield had not much to say against it, for his favorite beverage was gin and water, of which he took a considerable portion every day by dint of constant sipping, and to that I chiefly attributed his dingy complexion and wasping temper. Mr. Robson likewise encouraged Tom's propensity to persecute the lower creation. And what does it mean, the lower creation? So at the time, it was believed that animals were inferior to animals. Biographer Winnie, animals were considered inferior to humans. Biographer Winifred Géry notes that Brontë believed animals were created by God, like ourselves, to lead a free life over which man's only dominion should be to exercise a merciful care. So the Brontes, and especially, believe that God created animals and humans as equals. So humans should care for the animals. But this belief challenged the standard theology of the day, which depicted animals as having been born for our convenience, as animals being born to serve humans. So that was a mainstream belief at the time. So there was no such thing as animal rights or taking good care of a pet or animal, especially animals like horses or dogs, cows, sheep. They would be considered just objects for the benefit of human beings. And so Anne puts this characteristic violence to animals in the character of she. Oh, excuse me, in the character of Mr. Uncle Robson, because he's a terrible person, and only a terrible person would believe that animals were inferior to men and should live only for the convenience of humans. But because of that mindset, Uncle Robson transfers that mindset to Tom, who was already cruel to animals. And look what happens. As he frequently came to course or shoot over his brother-in-law's grounds, he would bring his favorite dogs with him, and he treated them so brutally that, poor as I was, I would have given a sovereign any day to see one of them bite him, provided the animal could have done it with impunity. Sometimes, when in a very complacent mood, he would go bird nesting with the children. And bird nesting was, this is prohibited now, of course, but bird nesting was searching for bird nests to steal their eggs for fun, as a fun activity. So he would go bird nesting with the children, a thing that irritated and annoyed me exceedingly, as by frequent and persevering attempts, I flatter myself I had partly shown them the evil of this pastime, and hoped in time to bring them to some general sense of justice and humanity. But 10 minutes bird nesting with Uncle Robson, or even a laugh from him at some relation of their former barbarities, was sufficient at once to destroy the effect of my whole elaborate course of reasoning and persuasion. Happily, however, during that spring, they never but once got anything but empty nests or eggs, being too impatient to leave them till the birds were hatched. That once, Tom, who had been with his uncle into the neighboring plantation, came running in high glee into the garden with a brood of little callowed nestlings in his hands. So Tom found a nest with uh, very, very young birds, nestlings in them, and he comes bringing them. Mary Ann and Fanny, whom I was just bringing out, ran to admire his spoils and to beg each a bird for themselves. No, not one, cried Tom. They're all mine. Uncle Robson gave them to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You shan't touch one of them. No, not one for your lives, continued him, as exultantly laying the nest on the ground and standing over it, with his legs wide apart, his hands thrust into his breeches pockets, his body bent forward, and his face twisted into all manner of contortions in the ecstasy of his delight. But you shall see me fettle them off. My word, but I will wallop them. See if I don't now. By gum, but there's rare sport for me in that nest. But Tom, said I shall not allow you to torture those birds. They must either be killed at once or carried back to the place you took them from, that the old birds may continue to feed them. But you don't know where that is, madam. It's only me and Uncle Robson that knows that. But if you don't tell me, I shall kill them myself, much as I hate it. You daren't touch them for your life, because you know Papa and Mamma and Uncle Robson would be angry. Ha ha, I've caught you there, miss. I shall do what I think right in a case of this sort, without consulting anyone. If your papa and mamma don't happen to approve of it, I shall be sorry to offend them, but your Uncle Robson's opinions, of course, are nothing to me. So she's being very stern here because it's really against her principles. She will not let him torture the birds. She would um, prefer to kill the birds right then, although she would hate it. But it would at least prevent them from being tortured in a very brutal way by the boy. So saying, urged by a sense of duty, at the risk of both making myself sick and incurring the wrath of my employers, I got a large flat stone that had been reared up for a mouse-trap by the gardener. Then, having once more vainly endeavored to persuade the little tyrant to let the birds be carried back, I asked what he intended to do with them. With fiendish glee, he commenced a list of torments. And while he was busied in the relation, I dropped the stone upon his intended victims and crushed them flat beneath it. I know it's terrible. It was terrible for me to read it the first time, terrible to read it again. But if you think about the alternative, the birds would have suffered much more. So I understand why she did it, although I would not have done it like that. Um, and like I mentioned earlier, the relationship with animals was different in the 19th century. It's not a loving, caring, respectful relationship as we have now, although and Agnes Grey shows a different approach. She respects them. She does not want them to come to harm. So she would rather kill them than let them suffer. Let me know what you think about this. I know it's a tough subject. I'm glad we've come a long way with the treatment of animals, but let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Loud were the outcries, terrible the execrations consequent upon this daring outrage. Uncle Robson had been coming up the walk with his gun, and was just then pausing to kick his dog. Tom flew towards him, vowing he would make him kick me instead of Juno. Mr. Robson leant upon his gun and laughed excessively at the violence of his nephew's passion. Instead of controlling him, he laughs at it, encourages it. And the bitter maledictions and opprobrious epithets he heaped upon me. Well, you are a good one, exclaimed he at length, taking up his weapon and proceeding towards the house. Damn me, but the lad has some spunk in him too. Curse me if ever I saw a nobler little scoundrel than that. He's beyond petticoat government already. By God, he defies mother, granny, governess, and all. Ha ha ha! Never mind, Tom, I'll get you another brood tomorrow. So he thinks it's great that he's a tyrant, that he rebels, that he defies mother, granny, governess, that he's beyond petticoat government, that he rebels against all female authority. What a bad influence. If you do, Mr. Robson, I shall kill them too, said I. Replied he, and having honored me with a broad stare, which, contrary to his expectations, I sustained without flinching, he turned away with an air of supreme contempt and stalked into the house. Tom next went to tell his mamma. It was not her way to say much on any subject, but when she saw me next, her aspect and demeanour were doubly dark and chill. After some casual remark about the weather, she observed, I am sorry, Miss Grey, you should think it necessary to interfere with Master Bloomfield's amusements. He was very much distressed about your destroying the birds. His amusement at the expense of the lives of those birds. When Master Bloomfield's amusements consist in injuring sentient creatures, I answered, I think it my duty to interfere. You go, Agnes. You seem to have forgotten, said she calmly, that the creatures were all created for our convenience. So she goes with the main with the mindset of the time. I thought that doctrine admitted some doubt, but merely replied, if they were, we have no right to torment them for our amusement. I think, said she, a child's amusement is scarcely to be weighed against the welfare of a soulless brute. But for the child's own sake, it ought not to be encouraged to have such amusements, answered I, as meekly as I could, to make up for such unusual pertinacity. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And she quotes scripture here. Of course, but that refers to our conduct towards each other. And then she quotes something else. The merciful man shows mercy to his beast. I ventured to add. I think you have not shown much mercy, replied she with a short, bitter laugh, killing the poor birds by wholesale in that shocking manner, and putting the dear boy to such misery for a mere whim. I judged it prudent to say no more. This was the nearest approach to a quarrel I ever had with Mrs. Bloomfield, as well as the greatest number of words I ever exchanged with her at one time, since the day of my first arrival. But Mr. Robson and old Mrs. Bloomfield were not the only guests whose coming to Wellwood House annoyed me. Every visitor disturbed me more or less, not so much because they neglected me, though I did feel their conduct strange and disagreeable in that respect, as because I found it so impossible to keep my pupils away from them as I was repeatedly desired to do. Tom must talk to them, and Marianne must be noticed by them. Neither the one nor the other knew what it was to feel any degree of shamefacedness or even common modesty. They would indecently and clamorously interrupt the conversation of their elders, tease them with the most impertinent questions, roughly color the gentlemen, climb their knees uninvited, hang about their shoulders or rifle their pockets, pull the ladies' gowns, disorder their hair, tumble their colors, and importunately beg for their trinkets. Terrible, terrible manners. Mrs. Bloomfield had the sense to be shocked and annoyed at all this, but she had not sense to prevent it. She expected me to prevent it. And how could I, when the guests, with their fine clothes and new faces, continually flattered and indulged them out of complaisance to their parents? How could I, with my homely garments, everyday face, and honest words, draw them away? And that is so true, right? She was supposed to educate them and to reform them. But how could she when everyone worked against her and she had so little power and so little authority in comparison? I strained every nerve to do so. By striving to amuse them, I endeavored to attract them to my side. By the exertion of such authority as I possessed, and by such severity as I dared to use, I tried to deter them from tormenting the guests, and by reproaching their unmannerly conduct to make them ashamed to repeat it. But they knew no shame. They scorned authority which had no terrors to back it. And as for kindness and affection, either they had no hearts, or such as they had were so strongly guarded and so well concealed that I, with all my efforts, had not yet discovered how to reach them. But soon my trials in this quarter came to a close, sooner than I either expected or desired. For one sweet evening towards the close of May, as I was rejoicing in the near approach of the holidays, and congratulating myself upon having made some progress with my pupils, as far as their learning went at least, for I had instilled something into their heads, as I had at length brought them to be a very little, more rational about getting their lessons done in time to leave some space for recreation instead of tormenting themselves and me all day long to no purpose. Mrs. Bloomfield sent for me and calmly told me that after midsummer my services will be no longer required. She assured me that my character and general conduct were unexceptional, but the children had made so little improvement since my arrival that Mr. Bloomfield and she felt it their duty to seek some other mode of instruction. Though superior to most children of their years in abilities, they were decidedly behind them in attainments. Their manners were uncultivated and their tempers unruly, and this she attributed to a want of sufficient firmness and diligent, persevering care on my part. So the blame is all hers. She did not do a good job, so she will be sent away after midsummer. And she was hoping that she was finally making a little bit of a difference. Now, that would uh, no longer continue. Unshaken firmness, devoted diligence, unwearied perseverance, unceasing care were the very qualifications on which I had secretly prided myself, and by which I had hoped in time to overcome all difficulties and obtain success at last. I wished to say something in my own justification, but in attempting to speak, I felt my voice falter. And rather than testify any emotion or suffer the tears to overflow that were already gathering in my eyes, I chose to keep silence and bear all like a self convicted culprit. Thus was I dismissed, and thus I sought my home. Alas, what would they think of me? So she's worried about what her family will think of her, as if she somehow failed only because it was not her fault. It was because of the circumstances. They were terrible circumstances. In another place, she would have thrived and have done a very good job. But she's worried about how her family is going to see that result of her being sent away, and that they would see it as um, a failure and as a confirmation of what they had initially thought, that she did not she was not suited to be a governess, or she did not have any skills, in fact, um, to um, to find her own way, her own path in the world. Unable, after all my boasting, to keep my place, even for a single year, as governess to 3 small children, whose mother was asserted by my own aunt to be a very nice woman. Having been thus weighed in the balance and found wanting, I need not hope they would be willing to try me again. And this was an unwelcome thought, for vexed, harassed, disappointed as I had been, and greatly as I had learned to love and value my home, I was not yet weary of adventure, not willing to relax my efforts. I knew all parents were not like Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield, and I was certain all children were not like theirs. The next family must be different, and any change must be for the better. I had been seasoned by adversity and tutored by experience, and I longed to redeem my lost honor in the eyes of those whose opinion was more than that of all the world to me. And that's the end of chapter 5. Um, so she has not given up yet. She wants to continue. She will try with a different family. Now she has gained experience. She knows more of the world, and she's not yet done with experiencing the world. She does not want to return to her bubble, her home, even though that's the place she loves the most and where the people she loves the most are. She's not yet ready to go back. She wants to prove herself, and that's what she's going to do in the following chapters. So I hope you're enjoying this novel by Anne Brontë, Agnes Grey. I think it's very interesting. It's like a window to the past to see what life was like for a governess in the Victorian era, right? And how children were reared at the time, and the mindset in relation to education, to raising children, to treating animals. It's really a window into the past, right? I hope you enjoy that as well. You have that sense of time traveling as you read, as I do. So next time we're going to read chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is called The Parsonage Again, and chapter 7, Horton Lodge. So that is her new destination. Um, and before I close this session, I would like to thank you for watching this class, for going on this journey with me, and also to reinforce the invitation for you to join the Classic Reader Week starting on Monday, the 23rd of September. So click on the link in the description box to register to save your spot. So you will only receive the link if you have signed up. And I wish you a lovely day, and I will see you next week. Bye.